It is good to be here with you as much as we can be together virtually, especially on such a day that starts with crazy news that involves politics and policy. It's good to spend this time now and center ourselves on what we can do positively in order to impact change. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today, or a lot about today actually, is how to affect change by telling your story, or how to draw upon your own experiences in order to convince. We're specifically going to look at legislators because they're who we need to convince right now in order to get our sector the relief that we need. So I'm going to share my screen, Demi, so that we can kind of launch into this process. So and I can show my PowerPoint. So here we go. All right, and everyone hopefully will be able to see that. We are going to talk, as I mentioned, about story and your story having power. And specifically today, we're going to take a look at recognizing why your story has power, first of all, because it does, and that means you do. And then we're also going to look about, not necessarily at research today, although that's always a significant part of your case, but we're going to focus on today is the power of your story. And specifically, we want this to be very practical so that you're actually crafting a statement. We're going to lay out a statement about, help you make a statement in terms of your story sharing. So the first question is, and I think it's fair to ask, is what is advocacy? What are we talking about when we mean advocacy? Because that goes around a lot in terms of circles and talking about what it is. Advocacy actually comes from the word for voice. I really like word origins. And advocacy comes from the Latin word or phrase ad vocare. And that means to call. So when you think about vocare, it's the root word of vocal. It's the root word of vocation. What is your calling? And most importantly, it is you calling for change. And in our case, change that involves the arts, calling, specifically giving voice to the voiceless. That's what advocacy is. Or if we want to move the metaphor from giving voice to the voiceless, from the ear to the eyes, it's also making the invisible visible. And that is what advocacy is doing. And one of the best examples of advocacy, particularly drawing on your own experience in order to make the visible visible, people who are ignored no longer ignored, issues that are ignored no longer ignored. One of the best examples that I can think of about that is the artist Fred Wilson. And I want to show a clip, and maybe Demi, you can show a clip of Fred Wilson talking about an exhibit he did a while back called Guarded View. And so listen to him explain that.
I wanted to be part of that manipulation. I should also say that in my college museum, I to support myself was a museum guard. And years later, I made this work called Guarded View. It's the guard uniforms of 4 different museums in New York City. And I always knew I'd make this piece, but I also felt, knowing guards, that they were on display, but also invisible. And it was kind of a weird combination. And so that's really what this piece is about. And in fact, in many museums in New York, and I imagine elsewhere, the museums get a great deal of either tax deductions or what have you, because they have a large minority employment in the museum. But the minorities are not in the professional staff, usually, in New York City. there in the maintenance, in the guards. So I figured I wanted to do a piece about it. Years later, after I'd made the piece, no, before I'd made the piece, I was invited to, and I was a fully working artist, I was invited by the Whitney to give a tour of one of their exhibitions. They're inviting artists to give tours of their exhibitions. And I said, well, I'll do it, but you know, I'll do it if I can be in costume. And they said, oh, great, the artist is going to be in costume. You know, I don't know if they thought I was going to be in a bunny suit or whatever, but so they agreed. And so I had lunch with the docents and some of the education staff, some of the people I'd known for many years because I was working in education in other museums. And so I said, at the end of lunch, I said, excuse me, I'm going to change my clothes now into my costume, and I'll meet you downstairs in the galleries. And they said, oh, great. So I went, and of course I know guards in many different museums because I used to work as a guard. So I borrowed a guard's uniform and stood by my sign that said, Fred Wilson Speaks, gives gallery tour. And I stood there, and all the people I had lunch with stood in front of me, milling around, waiting for me to show up. Yes, they did. And, you know, and then I said, well, let's get this thing going. They were all very embarrassed that, you know, I was standing right in front of them. But really, had it not happened, I would have been really surprised because you put on the uniform and you disappear. And so this was a performance I did. I walked through the installation, marking on the walls about the problems with the text, and because there were problems with the texts of this particular exhibition, and the crowd followed me around, and the people, you know, public would look at this and wondering what this guard is doing, talking about these things, and all the guards came off their station and said, you know, I always wanted to say that about that thing.
So I love that story from Fred Wilson. It's so powerful, and what we saw is Fred Wilson really drew upon his own story, upon his own experience as an art museum guard, to make the invisible visible, to call attention to the ignored. And actually the point that really stands out to me, right, is he calls upon a policy. Like, he talks about a tax deduction. So we see in that powerful moment his story all the way to policy even. And so I am convinced that the story is one of the most powerful ways to participate in advocacy. Now, I think it's really important to recognize too that you don't have to be a Fred Wilson. You don't have to be an amazing artist to draw upon your own experience to make a case for change. To call for arts, particularly direct grants to artists and arts organizations, particularly those who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, to call for them to finally get the fair share of support for the arts. And you don't have to be an artist, you just have to be an arts supporter to call on Congress to recognize the anxiety that so many of our artists face who have lost their jobs through no fault of their own and are facing, just experience the loss of the $600 unemployment that they received. You can do that. So we're going to talk about how to draw upon your experiences to talk with legislators. And now you might say, because the beginning of this conversation of this title of the session was why, you might say that, well, this is not really for me. You know, I don't see myself ever going out of my way to talk to a legislator. That's not something that I do. Well, I have two responses to that. One, in the literal sense, it should be something you do, something every one of us does. And in the wider sense, it's probably something you've already done. And what I mean by that, first in the literal sense, is we do need to actually meet with legislators, and we need to prepare to do that. Our sector, as all of you know, is reeling. Unemployment is incredibly high. Either you or your friends or colleagues are going through that. And the reality is that the only entity that has the size checkbook to give the resources we need is government right now. And that's why we have been calling for a change. And the people who make the decisions about where that government money goes are your legislators. So to impact that, we have to go right to the source. You have to go right to the source and convince them. That's what I mean in a literal sense, but this is something you have to do. But in a wider sense, if you've talked to a neighbor, if you've talked to a friend, if you've talked to a colleague, you're talking to a legislator. And let me basically tell you what I mean by that. The fair tax, you may have heard about that. It's a tax that would be a graduated tax. It'll change the way we tax in Illinois from just a straight flat rate for everyone, the millionaire and the person who works on the stage. And it'll allow Illinois to tax based on a graduated. Now, the person who earns more will be taxed at a higher rate. Guess who's the legislator on that one? The voters. If it receives enough votes, then it will be law. And so when you talk to someone, if they vote, or even if they care about the issue, you're talking to a legislator. So the examples and strategies that I'm going to give today not only apply to talking with legislators, but to talking with anyone, actually to fundraising and marketing in many ways too. So let's dive into it. And I'm going to get back to the PowerPoint here. And let me share my screen. And so you might ask why the story is so important, but mostly how you can use it. And we already talked about what advocacy is, and that you already have the opportunity to talk to legislators, even if you're talking to your neighbors. And many of you advocate every day. If someone hasn't listened to you on a customer service call and you make your case, you're being an advocate. But I want you to take confidence in talking to anyone using your story, because your story is genuine. When you tell it as a reason why you need change, or why change needs to be made, your story is genuine. You can basically give people a stat and you can debate it, but you can refute it. But someone's story, if told genuinely and truly, is irrefutable. It's what happened to them, right? And we want to focus on the values. And when you tell your story, you talk about what's important. And if we're going to win support for the arts, and this is something to keep in mind no matter who we talk to, if we're going to win support for the arts, if we're going to have Congress fund the NEA higher, or the state legislature provide the Illinois Arts Council with the funding it needs, we have to connect to values. When we talk to a legislator or neighbor, we win the person and not win the argument. That's key. We're good because we're smart, right? We're really good at winning the argument, the policy points, etc. But we need to think about the person that we're talking to and their values and their interests, and seek to connect to those. There's a difference between a position and someone's interest. And I'm particularly interested in how do we talk to people who don't think about the arts every day, or who maybe oppose, or on the border between opposing or supporting support for the arts. And with those individuals, we know their position, right? We know that they don't support a piece of legislation that we have, or they're skeptical about it. But what we need to think about is, what are their interests in doing that? What are they afraid of? What are they for? What are they concerned about? Let me give you an example of the difference I mean between position and interest. When my son was 3 years old, there was one night just before bedtime, he would not brush his teeth. I think he was 3, he was little, would not brush his teeth. And I was like, you need to brush your teeth. He would not brush his teeth. He had one position, no toothbrush. I had another position, And I focused on that, and we didn't get anywhere. I later some sun in my eyes. I later realized that he wouldn't brush his teeth because behind the shower curtain that was in the bathroom, he was convinced there was a monster. And if he was in the bathroom brushing his teeth, that monster was going to get him. His interest was self-preservation. It had nothing to do with brushing his teeth. And it wasn't until that dawned on me that we were able to get a spray can and pretend it was anti-monster juice and spray the monster out of the shower. And then he was willing to brush his teeth. There are times when we shouldn't focus too much at first on the policy, actually, sometimes what a person thinks about that, their position, but what they're interested in, what they're concerned about. And that could be maybe too much government they're scared about. That could be stereotypes they have about what the arts are or what's they are and are not. And so we need to keep those in mind as we craft our strategy. And that's a big part of the thinking that we need to do before we talk to a legislator or before we talk to someone. And then the other reason why you want to incorporate a story into talking with a legislator or anyone is because it's memorable. I was talking to a legislator last year, actually, and actually the last time I talked to them was the year before. What was fascinating is they did not repeat back to me the stats that I presented. They remembered and repeated back to me the story that the person who was with me told. It was memorable. So that's why, but now let's get into the what. And I'm going to refer to Drew Weston later, but he's a PhD who studied psychiatry, and then he got interested in politics, which is an interesting combination, psychiatry and politics. And he actually did MRI tests of what goes through someone's brain when they hear various policy messages and political messages. And this is what he found. I think it's interesting. He said, we did not see, this is when they played the various political messages, we did not see any increased activation of the parts of the brain that are normally engaged during reasoning. What we saw instead was a network of emotions lighting up. Network of emotions lighting up. And that's what we want to think about hooking into, because honestly, whether someone supports the NEA or not, it's not a rational decision. Even if you support it, we make our decisions based on the values and the guts that we have. Now, we may have a powerful story, but there's a difference between having it, you got to use it, and you got to tell it persuasively. One of the things that Drew Weston says is that good messaging is truth told well. We have the truth. Now let's learn how to do it well. Mark Twain said, a person who won't read has no advantage over one who can't read. So if we're not telling our stories and out there advocating, it's as if we never had a story, right? And so let's talk about what's important in terms of telling your story. One, make sure you know, this is a case statement we're making, but make sure you understand the system. And at the Alliance, we want to help you do that in terms of where the bill is at, what it involves, what the policies are, and how we can translate that into straight talk about what we ask. But we want to keep in mind, whether it's policy or political or fundraising this actually applies to, is what is driving this, and I'm going to switch forward a little bit, but what is driving this is the ask. Always keep the ask in mind. If it's to extend the $600 in benefits, that is the ask. And that is what is going to drive your story and these steps that we talk about in a little bit. Everything has to be driven by what we want to achieve. This is not just telling your story for the story's sake. This is telling your story to win change, to win a very specific policy and to hold the legislator accountable for that. So when we walk through these steps about crafting your story, and we actually have a worksheet on it, sometimes the goal is not to be 100% accurate, right? Remember, we're winning the person. So you have to think about the words that we use and be very careful of the words that we use. And so I'm going to pull Drew Weston back in here again. And can we play the video for that? This is Drew Weston after he's presenting the brain research, talking about what words we need to keep in mind when we tell our story. So can we play that, Demi? Here it goes. And oh, by the way, don't really mind the screen. This was done actually during the healthcare reform debates. And he's going through words that work and maybe different words that work. And by the way, sometimes we could spend some time and do this with the arts. I'd love to do that. But let's go ahead and play the video. Listen mostly to the sound, not to the slide.
I'll give you some examples. So the unemployed, I mean, these are people who may have had to say to their kids, you know, I'm really sorry, but this isn't going to be your room anymore. How do you tell that to your kids? Okay? When you say the unemployed, you are literally activating the wrong networks of the brain. You're activating that conscious, abstract, rational stuff up here, but you're not activating any feeling. If instead you say people who've lost their jobs, or people who've lost their jobs through no fault of their own, how many of you just felt something? How many of you felt empathy? Well, you're a nasty crowd, only a couple of you. All right, so the difference between those two ways, well, I'll say it a different way. If ever you want to hurt a particular group of people or make them the enemy, call them the blank. All right? So if you say, for example, the rich versus the rest of us, which happens to be pretty apt right now. When you say the rich, no one's thinking about a kind rich person they know. They're thinking about this abstraction of a bunch of people who are getting more and more and more of what we produce in this country, and who just got a tax cut of around 15%, and who didn't have to work for it. We'll come back to that if we can. So it actually, just to drive this point home, when you say the unemployed, it activates this. When you say people who've lost their jobs, it activates networks up here that go straight to emotion circuits. The reason I emphasize, and those are, by the way, those are networks that evolved over millions of years in us, and there are similar networks, not for language, in other primates, but they evolved. Whenever you are thinking or feeling something about people, this gets activated. And you're more likely to have sympathy for them if you do, more likely to have empathy. The underemployed, it's a horrible term to use.
So I went a little too long. If you want to look back at Obamacare camp, but the two clips that was really emphasizing is speaking someone else's language. And so what that means, and I'm going to flip to a very practical part now, because now we're going to get into how to take all those things that we've been thinking and move it into something practical so that you can talk to a legislator. What that means then is when you start, and I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint right again, we're going to walk through 6 steps. So how do you use your story in a way that looks to interest, that uses the words carefully? And the first thing, you do before you meet with a legislator is you do your research. And again, we can help you with that. But you think about where they have been. Congressman Kinzinger used to be in the military, or still is in the military. And so when we talked to him on an Arts Advocacy Day, we focused on what the arts can do for veterans. It's something he values about. It's an interest that he has, and that we have too. So we did our research about who the legislator is, and that's part of what needs to happen, to pause and think about what makes them tick. But when you go to a representative's office, or now it's virtually, and we'll get into that, but when you go to a representative's office, the first thing that you want to do, step 1, and you can actually write these out ahead of time, you should, to practice, because you're not going to get a lot of time. The first thing that you want to do, let me bring this up a little broader here. The first thing you want to do, obviously, is identify yourself. Sometimes you get so nervous that you rush right into the message.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Can you share your screen?
Yeah. Let me share it right here. First thing you want to do as a presenter is make sure that you're sharing your screen. Actually, the first thing you want to do when you meet with a legislator is to identify yourself, center them, say your name so that they know you're a person, and look them in the eye and smile, of course. Say where you're from, but not just a city. I'm from Chicago, I'm from Peoria. Give the neighborhood, maybe say you live near a park. The next thing you want to do, and this can take a couple sentences, is to simply educate them about what you do. Maybe you're an actor, or you say where you have acted, or you talk about the type of music that you do, and you indicate that you're there to support the arts. Legislators have a ton of stuff on their plate. They talk about healthcare one moment, then defense spending, and then they're rushed to their meeting with you. So center them and let them know that 101, hey, I'm an actor and I'm here to talk about, say, funding for the arts. And now you get into your story. Now you've centered them. They know, okay, this is what this person's here for. This person's a constituent. That means they could possibly vote or not vote for me. So you've grounded them. And maybe at this point, and this is why I got to write it out and practice ahead of time. At this point, it's maybe been 2 or 3 minutes. That's it. Now you share your story's essentials. And we're going to have 2 people after this give an example of this. So I'm just kind of go through the general steps, and they'll show you kind of what it looks like. But you want to talk about, so for example, if you're struggling to make ends meet because you've lost all of your work, all of your jobs, you want to share what that is like. You want to share, for example, if you've lost your home, you want to share that has occurred. You want to share what bills you can't pay, if that's the possibility. But you're talking through, you're setting the stage for what you're going through. You're describing the facts that are occurring in your life. And then you get to the heart of it, which is step 4. And you want to explain a memorable experience that encapsulates the need for the policy change. To give you an example of that, I used to do some contract work for the Hemophilia Federation of America, which talks about bleeding disorders. And we used this 6-step process. And I remember one of the mothers who was talking to a legislator. She identified herself. She said she was a mother of a boy who had bleeding disorders. She talked about the fact that they lost their house because the medicine's so expensive, and what a struggle it is when you can't pay for the prescription drugs. And I still remember many years later, her step 4. She said, I was watching my son play on the playground and he slipped. And that can be very dangerous if there's a big cut. And I remember her saying, one of the first things I thought was, how am I going to pay for that if he gets hurt? And she talked about, very briefly, a mother shouldn't have to think about that first. She shouldn't have to think about how she's going to pay for the health insurance. She was thinking about the safety of her son. And that encapsulated the need. And when it comes to a story, or when it comes to a relatable experience, it's a moment in time. It's not the whole movie. You're explaining a scene that makes it meaningful. And then of the 6 steps, you go to, let me show this a little bit better. Then after the 6 steps, you go to the 5th one. And the 5th one is where you get to the call, or the vocare. And that can involve different phrases. And you can actually use these phrases right here and fill in the blanks. But then you get to the engine that's driving the whole train. And that is, you've shown why this policy change is needed. And so now you make the call for policy. You can say, for example, and you repeat your story, you can say, because I have to worry about putting groceries on the table, and I no longer can focus on my organization's art because my organization's going under. I call on you to finally continue the loans that are so important to keeping nonprofits like mine going. Or you can talk about the effect of your workers, but what you want to do is you want to give the clear ask, and don't let them off the hook. You give the ask, and if it's a bill number, use the bill number, be as specific as possible. But remember, this is the whole reason why you're sharing the story, is to get change. You can tell, I've seen it before, where people will tell wonderful stories. They'll go steps 1 through 4, and then they'll stop. And the legislator, who I know doesn't agree with the policy, I've heard say, oh, that's great. I really, sorry you have to go through it. And that's it. You want to put the ask in front of them. And then after you do that, be silent. Teachers are really good at this. You make a statement and you say, will you support this? And you don't let them off the hook. Be quiet, see what their answers are. And remember, that positive tension is what I call that, is good. And even if the legislator agrees with you, you still need to do this so that they can hear the why. And you still need to ask them to support, because you want to make sure your allies are there as well. Now, the thing that I want to emphasize, and here's some examples here in terms of avoid jargon. If you can incorporate in a meaningful, genuine way with the students and student artwork, and you can empower them to do it, and that's another session, do that. And be brief as possible in practice. So these steps are not meant to be a prescription. You can mix these up a little bit if you want to. You can try new things. This is intended to be steps to help you think through what you're doing and how you're going to do it and how you're going to make your case. So let's see, we have 2 people, Aimee and Bindu, who I am so glad can assist us today, because they're amazing people. And so they're going to practice kind of their version of this, keeping some of the things in mind, mixing it up a little bit maybe, but pretending to talk. First, let's go with you, Aimee, pretending to talk to a legislator. And then we're going to go with Bindu, who's pretending to talk to a neighbor. Can we hand it over to them, Denny?
Yep, Bindu and Aimee, if you want to turn your cameras on. There we go.
Just go for it. Hey there, my name is Aimee Tin, and I'm a filmmaker, writer, and performer from the 46th Ward. I work with a number of arts organizations like Second Story, Women of the Now, Free Street Theater, and more. My work focuses on telling the stories that represent our community in Uptown and the stories of queer folks and folks of color all over Chicago. The pandemic has hit the arts, from film to theater to live performance, hard. Most artists are still struggling to make ends meet. In those first weeks, I watched as live events I was producing were canceled, as I canceled film shoots for the safety of my cast and crew, as clients backed out of upcoming contracts. And just like that, my spring and summer income disappeared, tens of thousands of dollars. I'd spent years getting myself to the point of making the majority of my income art making. If it hadn't been for the CARES Act unemployment insurance, particularly the additional $600 per week, I would have ended up in a huge hole. I'm lucky to have a temporary position at the moment, but another relief bill is still needed because my colleagues and friends have not been so lucky. They've lost that desperately needed $600 per week. It's gone down to $300 for some of them, and will soon be gone. Have you enjoyed art during these socially distanced times? Have you watched a film, read a book, binged a TV show? A whole team of people made that possible for you, because we are now depending upon you. I ask you to vote yes on the updated HEROES Act, which would restore those $600 through January 21st. Will you vote yes?
Thanks, Amy. One of the things that I love about that is ending with the question. She tied herself to the community because legislators think that way. They want to know what's happening in the community. I love that she put questions in. When you meet with a legislator, it's not necessarily a one-way stage production. It becomes a communication or a dialogue, and she invited that by asking those questions. And you know, she didn't just do it spur of the moment. She wrote it out, she practiced it, and was ready to go. But again, don't worry if you mess up a little bit when you're talking to a legislator. It just emphasizes that you're human. So you don't have to be perfect. You just need to be human and tell your story. And that's you. That's good. Bindu is going to go next. And she's going to give an example of one of the things that we've mentioned earlier, fair tax. Not talking to a legislator, but keep in mind that's something you can talk to anybody about. So go ahead, Bindu.
Hey folks. Okay, I'm going to be pretending that I'm talking to my neighbor, Jenny. Hi Jenny, I haven't seen you in a few days. So good to see you. Have you switched compost services already? Okay, let me know when you do. Maybe we can coordinate that. I really love that idea. Mine's been going great so far. Hey, I wanted to chat about something real quick now that voting's begun. Have you heard about the vote on fair tax that's on the ballot? Can we talk about that for a second? Okay, so you might already know I am an immigrant myself. I came to Chicago about 10 years ago on scholarship for school. And since then, I've been making art and doing community organizing, including here in the neighborhood, which, you know, we've both done a lot of that together. And I've never had a lot of money, even though I've been doing work that feels really essential. Right now, I'm making about $35,000 a year. And my friends and loved ones are making less than that very often. And they struggle so hard to stay involved in this work that feels really essential, like art making and fighting for fair housing and adequate healthcare, because they always have to make tough choices to fight for their own safety and security instead. Like last year, I just had to take a job for health insurance, for example, and that made it impossible for me to be part of this performance project that I was really passionate about. And the art project couldn't pay me because they were super underfunded. And this year I had 2 people drop out of working on the Cops Out CPS campaign with me because they lost their jobs because of COVID at the restaurants that they worked at. And this is a story that I see over and over and over and over again, is people struggling and making tough choices to move away from the things that they feel like they should be doing for their community and instead just trying to take care of their own survival. And I've seen firsthand how extraordinarily different life is for families who make hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars more than me. And luxuries aside, what they felt was a sense of safety and security that I or my loved ones just don't have. They don't have to worry the way we do about a job or healthcare or a place to live. And beyond that, they have the safety and security to dream big and fight for the things that they want and take risks in a way that we can't, and make art in a way that's just so much harder for so many people. And I really strongly believe that all of us deserve that kind of basic safety and security. Don't you? Yeah. So right now we're all being taxed the same percentage, which is absurd. And fair tax, which is on the ballot right now, finally allows us to tax rich and super rich people at a slightly higher rate than working class and middle class folks. And that will put $3 billion back into the state and the exact kinds of state services that could give us all that kind of basic safety and security, like jobs and healthcare and social services. And I think that would transform the health and well-being of the people that I love. And so that's why I know I'm going to vote yes for fair tax. Will you?
Thanks, Bindu. I will vote for the fair tax. As from a policy point of view, many of you may not see the connection between fair tax and the arts, but what it's all about is if our state doesn't have the revenue coming in, there's going to be some serious serious cuts, potential cuts that we're already seeing it to the arts. And so if we argue for funding for the arts, we also take the role of arguing for the revenue to come in, not to mention tax relief that's needed for lower income artists. But what I thought was really interesting, like that's the goal, right? Bindu just kept her eye right on the goal, but she actually came at it from the advantage point of an individual's experience. She didn't start right in and say, arts important is really fun, arts funding is really important. We need to pass the fair tax, although that's what we're getting at. What she did is she connected with the person and experienced her personal experience. I also thought it was really helpful, like what does compost have to do with this whole conversation? Why did she start that way? She started that way because that's something she's connected with the person before, and that's something probably the person's interested in. So she sought to make that connection first, to connect on something. And that might not be the arts, but you need to get to it fairly quickly. One of the things, to get back to Amy, one of the things she did mention the CARES Act, and that is an acronym. And you want to, in general, if you can't always do that. But you want to avoid acronyms. But when you're talking with a legislator, which was the case with Amy, it's okay to use acronyms that involve the name of a legislation, et cetera, because people, legislators are going to be used to that, and they're going to usually be prepped for that. Before I wrap up and we take some questions, I do want to pause just for a moment and briefly address those of you who are white. Everyone's story has equal value because every person has equal value. But not everyone's story calls for equal prominence. Those whose stories have been ignored, the stories of people of color, those must have prominence now in the arts sector story advocacy. But now, what does that mean, especially with the topic at hand when you're talking to your legislators? Well, what it means that BIPOC voices must have a prominent role of ownership and leadership in planning and coordinating a campaign's visits with legislators. What it means is that those who have access to legislators have an obligation to share that access. What it means is that we should always remember that we own our own stories. We don't own other people's stories. They tell those stories. But this is not an excuse for some of us to sit on the sidelines. It is possible to advance change. It's even necessary for a person to draw upon their own story to call attention to inequity, even if they are not directly experiencing inequity themselves. And for example, in Illinois, whether or not a student has arts education depends largely on their zip code, on their race. And kids on the north side of Chicago tend to have a greater access to arts learning than those on the south and west side. And I know we're statewide, but I just want to focus on Chicago as an example. My own two children, even during this remote learning now, regularly have dance classes and they have music classes. If I can explain that to a legislature about why that is meaningful to them, how playing the drums has given my son confidence and joy, then I can ask the legislator, why should my child get that? Just because of where he lives and not another child. So, but no matter what our individual experience is, I wanna encourage us to use our stories, to use it effectively. If we do it well, and if we make our case strategically, we can affect change. Not overnight, but we can win reforms. Now, usually we do this in a longer workshop to get into the details of details of like how to craft your story and even practice it with each other. But we don't have time for that today. But I think that we do have time for some questions, if there are any questions. And I see that there is a question. And also I want to encourage, you can either maybe, I don't know if we can put this through question or put in chat, if you've had experiences, if you have experiences with talking with legislators or neighbors and things that have worked or things that have not worked, then please put them into chat. I really encourage you to share that because you may have different experiences than these, and you may have your own experiences that you want to share. The question is, you mentioned a worksheet, and is it possible to get a copy of the worksheet? Yes, I believe that we can make a copy available so that we have it. There's another question that how do BIPOC who are interested in advocacy gain access to legislators? One of the things that we want to do, just I'm going to do a quick aside first, but getting to that, is who the legislator is makes a big difference. If there's a bill going through a certain committee, you want to focus on members of that committee, particularly the chair of that committee. So oftentimes you'll target legislators based on the influence they have or the formal position that they have. How do BIPOC who are interested in advocacy gain access to legislators? I think a lot of that is working through the organizations that you have, first and foremost to gain access to your own legislator, because they are going to be the ones who will listen to you most and whose job it is, whose responsibility it is to listen to you. So that's always going to be the most effective. And one of the best ways with your own legislator is to simply call them out of the blue, and you keep calling until you're able to get an audience with them. And in this day of Zoom, what that can mean is setting up a conversation kind of like we're having now. Usually the legislator's office can do that. There's some advantages to that because you can have more people usually involved if you want to have a group meet, and I always encourage that. And that's one of the benefits of remote. But start with your own legislator, contact them directly. Contact them through an organization if you're part of a civic organization, or you're part of your theater, you're part of your music organization. Those are really active, and if you contact them as part of an organization or through an organization, you oftentimes have a better chance. In terms of legislators outside of your own network, how to get access, that's where it comes down to the Alliance and to organizations like us to open up access when we can. That's what we seek to do through action alerts, even though that's an email, it's kind of another form, but it's meaningful. And that's part of our responsibility too. And I think if this is something you're interested in, let us know. And I also say you have an outside game of like telling your story. And then you also have an inside game where we as an organization try to pool resources to have advocacy days and things like that we work towards as we can. I hope that's helpful. We can talk off things too if there's other ideas, and if people have ideas about gaining that access, you can feel free to put it in chat. Let's see. I think that we have. Do you offer artists or arts organizations that are interested in going deeper into this work? We have done so in the past, and that's certainly something that I think we can think about. We will make the worksheet available, and so I encourage you to just walk through those steps and write them out and practice. And again, this can be used not just for meeting with legislators. It can be used with talking to anyone about the value of the arts. And so in many ways then it's akin to marketing. I think what's interesting is I used to teach a class in nonprofit policy and advocacy, and I had this kind of running joke with the other adjunct professor who did marketing, where we would switch slides. Like they would give me a slide about effective marketing and I would give them a slide about effective nonprofit advocacy, and we kind of joke that they both fit. So there are overlaps. What is the best way to find out how to connect our work to policy? That is a great question, because policy has to drive. Like, one thing I like to say is that there's no organization, there's no nonprofit organization that has a mission that won't be impacted by one policy or another. There's no theater, there's no visual arts organization, there's no dance company that in the end, its policy, in the end, its mission will not be impacted one way or another by policy. We're seeing that today with a lack of another round of relief. And so nonprofits should always be involved in advocacy because it's mission work, it's work to advance your mission. And what I think needs to happen is to look at the policies that are out there, that are on the table, that are being debated. And we actually have those, and we can provide the link maybe afterwards. We have those, these are the policies that we're looking for. And to go through them and to call us if you have questions about what they mean. Call me, give me a call, we'll talk about it. To go through that list of policies and say, you know, which one of these are going to hit me, impact my story, impact the stories of my audience, my dancers, my actors, and then dig into more of that. And we can provide more of that information too. Yes, again, it's connecting that. I do want to add, because I do think this is important, because I know that we have nonprofits on the line. Believe it or not, nonprofits can lobby. Lobbying is talking directly to a legislator to support a specific piece of legislation. And if you're a 501c3 charitable organization, if you're a nonprofit theater, you can lobby. Now you have to we can provide you more information on that. You have to, it can't be a substantial part of your work, but you can do it. What you can do is be involved in elections and supporting one candidate or another. But actually something like a fair tax, everyone's considered the legislators. So that's okay to be involved in too, because it's more like lobbying or legislating. So you, instead of getting involved in elections, so you can do it. And I would say you should do it. And we can do a whole nother workshop, and we have a recording of one about what you can and can't do very specifically. But it's not an excuse not to get involved. If anyone needs to voice right now, it's arts organizations and theaters. Again, to make our needs that are invisible, the needs of people who are invisible, to legislators, to make them visible, and to be a voice for issues that are being ignored, including artists who are being ignored during this very, very difficult time. But again, the hope is your story. If you have questions, I think we're running out of time, but if you have questions, you can contact me, you can contact the Alliance, because ultimately, you know, we're in this together, and we're in it to affect change together, and we will do that.